Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar co-organized by the UNU's International Institute for Global Health and the Collective for the Political Determinants of Health. My name is Vyoma Sharma, and I'm a researcher at the Center of Global Sustainability, University of Oslo, and I will be your moderator for this webinar on examining wealth, power, and accountability in philanthropy. We will present key findings from IIGH's new research paper on Novo Nordisk Foundation and discuss the emergence, evolution, and future of large philanthropies. As tax-exempt entities, private foundations are committed to charitable purposes, but unlike private charities, their funding is sourced from private wealth of an individual, a family, or a corporation. They hold unprecedented endowments, pursue ambitious agendas, and exert a growing influence on research, policy, and governance. So, for example, the Gates Foundation has recently been second only to the US government in funding the WHO. Along with the Novo Nordisk Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, it is also amongst the world's largest health philanthropies. The scale of influence has generated great interest and renewed debates on wealth, power, and accountability, especially when some of these foundations control resources that eclipse the GDP of many countries. The appeal of private foundations as an organizational setup suggests that the ultra-wealthy are not against wealth distribution per se, but that they would much rather control total authority over that agenda. So whether or not one sees them as a force for good, it is no longer possible to ignore private foundations. This brings us to some critical concerns, such as what does the growing influence of philanthropy mean for multilateral cooperation? How do we distinguish traditional charitable giving with newer models such as donor-advised funds, limited liability companies, or venture capital firms? And what are the democratic implications of private foundations that wield power without being elected or accountable in the ways that governments are? Also, any meaningful critique of philanthropy becomes trickier when public imagination is so gripped currently by the veneration of wealth. In this webinar, our panelists will address some of these questions. We are joined today by Adam Feierskov from the Danish Institute for International Studies, Marta Ray Garcia from University of A Coruña, and Tobias Young from the University of St. Andrews. Before we begin, a quick note about Q&A. Please use the chat box to submit your questions, and we'll address them after the presentation. We begin with a brief presentation by Adam, who is the author of the new research paper on Novo Nordisk Foundation, and he will share key findings from it. At the Danish Institute for International Studies, Adam studies contemporary global inequalities across technology, science, humanitarianism, and development, focusing on how global and local priorities shape visions of progress and future. He is the author of multiple books, including Goodwill Corrupting, which was published earlier this year, and The Global Lab, which came out in 2022. Adam serves as editor-in-chief of Progress and Development Studies and the Danish journal Samfundsøkonomen, and holds roles in several development policy and research councils. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you so much, Vyoma. And I'll try to keep the time. Thank you for that introduction as well. I hope everything is working well with the microphone and all, and the PowerPoint as well, I can see. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to talk to everyone a little bit about the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is evidently, as we will see, and as you are able to read in this paper, which I'm sure you've had multiple links to already through your registration, and if not, I'm sure you can find it in the chat and afterwards, where you can learn a lot more in detail, because I only have 15 minutes to go through these things. But we will see a story of a foundation that has grown massively, both in its endowment over the past 5-7 years, but also very much in its global ambition, and zoom in on what this tells us about the state of private foundation play currently in global health and what we can expect from things moving forward. So I think if we just go to the next slide, I can open up a little bit on what the sort of basics are of the foundation. It is a very old foundation. It comes from a Danish tradition of, and that will be a centerpiece, I think, of the discussion we'll have, but also of knowing what exactly a kind of animal the Novo Nordisk Foundation is. Namely, that it's a commercial foundation. It is not a philanthropic foundation, and it has existed as a commercial foundation for more than 100 years now. It could celebrate its 100th year last year, but also a foundation, as I said, that's gone through massive growth over the past years. In 2024, it provided approximately $1.4 billion in grants to a little more than 1,800 projects. And it, in theory, holds an endowment that positions it as the largest private foundation globally. But I think it's important to say, and there are many details as to how you calculate these things, but only a certain amount of those assets are actually accessible for philanthropic purposes. And much, if not most of it, is tied to corporate holdings. We'll get back to some of those details. But also just in terms of its grant making, it is situated as one of the largest foundation. And it has far, far more than doubled, tripled, quadrupled. We will see its both its grant making capacity, but also its grant making over the past years. And it has this dual mission that sets it aside from normal philanthropic foundations, which is that it has a set of commercial ambitions that it has to follow. So it needs to ensure that the Novo Group, which we'll get back to, including what Novo Nordisk AS, the company, is, but that it needs to ensure world-class business results through research-based products. This is also what distinguishes it from many other kinds of foundations that we know and that we usually talk about, where there are a lot of discussions around sort of how closely interlinked are the philanthropic and the commercial ambitions between perhaps the individuals being behind some of these foundations. I've worked a lot with the Gates Foundation, and of course we've also had, we've had for many years discussions of how closely tied certain philanthropic endeavors of the Gates Foundation are to its commercial, to Bill Gates's personal commercial aims. In this case, the commercial ambitions are front and center. Once you are a commercial foundation as the Novo Nordisk Foundation, you do, if we move on to that side of things, control the majority stake in a pharmaceutical or in a range of pharmaceutical companies, central among them, of course, being Novo Nordisk AS. So it holds the foundation 77% of voting rights in the company Novo Nordisk through an investment firm that it owns that is called Novo Holdings. As I said, if we look at endowments, only a certain amount of those are accessible for philanthropic purposes. That's why it's a little bit of a sort of wrongful interpretation to look at its value as encompassing the entirety of its potential philanthropic endowment. It also, if we look to summer last year, had a market capitalization, the company of Novo Nordisk AS, that exceeds the entire GDP of Denmark. It has now decreased over the past year and more, where it's been challenged a lot on the commercial side by other pharmaceutical companies, but also of expectations from shareholders and so forth. But there are some astounding numbers of the importance of Novo Nordisk AS in a Danish financial context, where, for example, only in 2023, where some of our numbers are from, the Novo group of companies contributed 18% of Denmark's total corporate taxes. So very, very, very much. As the Novo Nordisk AS market capitalization has been decreasing a bit, we've actually been able to see a direct impact on the growth prospects of the entire Danish economy. So if we move to the next slide, where I can see there are a few mistakes, but it's an attempt to just draw out how we see the commercial arm and a philanthropic arm. So if you look on the left side, the headings or subheadings here of Novonesis all the way through are a mistake. I don't know how it sort of came to be. The first is the Novo Nordisk AS, which is in itself a biomedical company that many of you probably know, which also has a small philanthropic arm itself. But everything it does is more or less, at least in theory, controlled by the Novo Nordisk Foundation that owns the voting rights, the majority of the voting rights in Novo Nordisk AS. The second blue blurb is supposed to be Novo Holdings, which is, as the name suggests, a holding and investment company that is owned completely by Novo Nordisk Foundation, where essentially it involves or invests in a long range of pharmaceutical companies, biomedical startups, and so forth. And finally, we have the real Novonesis, which is a biosolutions company demerged from Novo Nordisk in the late 1990s. But I think it's important to understand that we have the Novo Nordisk Foundation. We have a World Diabetes Foundation, which is also funded partly through NNF, and that plays a role as a separate but still related foundation. And then you obviously have direct grant making by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, and that's what we focus on mostly here. If we look at the corporate mission of the Novo Nordisk Foundation in the bottom, you can sort of see that it is to be an engaged owner of Novo Nordisk AS, Novo Nordisk, and Novo Holdings, these three major companies or entities. And that it is also set in this world to generate attractive investment returns on foundation assets, as we know it from many foundations, and make strategic investments with the main goal of supporting the foundation's strategy, which we will get back to. So if we move to the next slide, just briefly going through, I don't want to spend too much time on this because time is obviously running and you can read much more about it in the paper. But if we divide the sort of lifetime of Novo Nordisk, even though it's more than 100 years, which is a little bit unfair, we had a long period during the first more than 80 years where the foundation was mainly, aside from obviously still being the owner of Novo Nordisk AS, or what became Novo Nordisk AS, a supporter of the research ecosystem in Denmark. So Danish medical research, physiology, endocrinology, diabetes, and then we had in the late 80s the merger that created the sort of modern Novo Nordisk Foundation. It had several names before that. With a very traditional grant committee structure, very few employees, this sort of very conventional, conservative way that we've seen many foundations in the past work, where you have a board that is in some respects reactive, reacting to certain applications for funding, but also very strong connection just to the Danish environment, an ecosystem of medical research. Then as we reach the 2010s, we essentially begin to see fairly major investments by the Novo Nordisk Foundation and a gradual expansion. So major research centers, again, in Denmark, Steno diabetes centers, a network of diabetes centers with research on diabetes, massive investment, mainly in Denmark. In 2013, a strategy to double funding by 2018, which was exceeded many times. And we also begin to see this gradual professionalization, if we can call it that, of the foundation. So it still had only 3 employees by 2009, which is, I think, astounding, but has since moved far past 200 employees. In this second phase, we also saw the vast majority of grants being made to Danish institutions and still mainly focused on research. If we then look at a third phase, which I've coined global ambitions here, because that's very much what has been at stake. A new strategy has been produced towards 2030 with a series of focus areas that we'll get back to, but also very much the new CEO in 2023 coming out and launching, so to speak, almost the Novo Nordisk Foundation as a global foundation. So we see a major increase in ambition at this point in time. The Danish share begins to drop. That is not that it drops in sort of in relative, or it only drops in relative terms because we still see a massive amount of investment, but in Denmark, but we see overall an increase in the entirety of the funds that it spends internationally. In 2024, it makes its largest foundation grant ever, and it is also the largest grant ever made in Danish history, which is to a green tripartite agreement in the government, where the foundation declares a support of 10 billion Danish kroner or 1.4 billion dollars. We also see, and we'll obviously get back to that, increasing amount of partnerships with the Gates Foundation, with Wellcome Trust, and a gradual but very strong internationalization of its activities. So the next slide is a little bit on the strategic evolution. I won't rest too much with that. I only have a few minutes left, but what we can see is that in the beginning of the 2020s here, we still had a strategy benefiting people and society with a number of long-term objectives, but still primarily Danish, Nordic focus explicitly in the strategy. It had a goal to quadruple grant outputs in 2023, or to reach a level of 220 million disbursed. The actual result was 1.2 billion by the time we reached 2023. So vastly overreaching in terms of its strategic ambition. The new strategy has a focus on people and planet, but also on these three major strategic areas of health, sustainability, and life science ecosystem. And despite, or I think there are certain continuities here, despite this global trend, which is still this very deep investment in Danish R&D infrastructure that can support Novo Nordisk, medical education in Denmark, medical research in Denmark. By 2023, it was funding 1 out of 10 positions at the University of Copenhagen altogether, providing more than $100 million to the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences alone. Yeah. So if we move for the final minutes here to the future outlook for the foundation, and then just key strategic questions as well I want to touch on. I think it's very clear to everyone, and you can also read that from the paper, that this is the beginning of a journey that will maintain the Novo Nordisk Foundation in an upwards trajectory. And we will only see it increase its grant making and increase its international presence, and not least grow its policy and political engagement and advocacy. I mean, this is something we've seen of several other large foundations, including the Gates Foundation, as they have internationalized and realized the potential that lies in strong advocacy and political engagement. They have sort of, many of them moved from maybe a position of distance or more peripheral position to being heavily engaged in global governance, which is what we'll also discuss here more generally. It still remains a challenge, if we can put it like that, to fully internationalize the Novo Nordisk Foundation, because it is heavily invested in the Danish ecosystem. It is, in many respects, a foundation unlike others. So not being a philanthropic foundation per se, but a commercial foundation, wherein it serves a purpose of making or of sort of serving the companies that it owns to the greatest extent. At least that's the legal status of the company. But it is also, or of the foundation, but it is also a foundation like others. And I think that's a key thing, an argument to make here. The vast internationalization that we see, the deep strategic turn, much more proactive, with an aptitude for being in the driver's seat in terms of co-creating, but also defining its interventions, what it would like to support, where it would like to support it, and the extent to which it would, is something that we've seen across many foundations as their international ambitions have grown. And in the final slide, I pose there are three major, I think, strategic outlooks and implications for global health governance. One is, of course, the commercial philanthropic entanglement that we see for a foundation like the Novo Nordisk Foundation. It owns, it controls the pharmaceutical companies funding it. It has an explicit mission of ensuring the Novo group of companies deliver world-class business results, right? So one example being training of health professionals in diabetes diagnosis, which is, of course, a necessary capacity building locally, including in many countries in the global south, but it is also obviously avenues of market development at the same time. Foundation investments in R&D, workforce, infrastructure that essentially directly also benefit the commercial arm, which is the purpose of the foundation. So it's not an add-on, it is at the core mission and mandate of the foundation. We also see the strong concentration of power and influence, obviously with Novo Nordisk A/S having a large share of the global diabetes market, again stressing this self-reinforcing cycle of market success that then produces philanthropic capital in theory that can be invested into market-shaping investments. Knowledge infrastructure I don't need to touch on here, but also the sheer temporality at play here. So the long-term plays or the long-term grants that the foundation is making is very crucial, I think, in terms of obviously locking certain sectors, certain institutions into certain arrangements and research paradigms. When you, for example, see the massive investments in medical research vis-a-vis social sciences. And finally, the political influence, including the accountability gaps. I mean, this investment, as I said, of the green tripartite has sort of been described popularly as being decided over SMS, over a text between foundation leadership and Danish politicians. There's been a lot of discussion of how that process has looked like and what it will look like in the future, because this is a grant that is only beginning to be realized. We also see the very, very strong influence from foundation leadership on Novo Nordisk A/S. So I think when the CEO of Novo Nordisk A/S was essentially fired earlier this year, not long ago, it was a decision largely made by the chairman of the board of the foundation, Lars Rebien, who is himself a former CEO of Novo Nordisk A/S. So an instance where I think it suddenly became very clear to the public the extent to which the foundation has a very, very strong influence. At the same time, finally, we see a set of Danish regulatory frameworks that are not really designed for this kind of mega philanthropy or mega foundation in which you have this very strong entanglement of both the commercial and the philanthropic arms. And we also see something that I've stressed other places elsewhere, and that's very strong for many foundations, namely this ability to also interpret and shift its identity. So in certain instances, it will revert back to its legal status and the requirements put upon it as a commercial foundation. But we also see it increasingly in many political spaces, moving, maneuvering, acting as a global institution, as a global philanthropic foundation, and as a global organization and policy-making organization altogether. So that was my intervention on the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Thank you so much, Vyoma.
Thank you, Adam. And our audiences can read Adam's research paper. The link is in the webinar chat box. You can also continue submitting your questions and we'll get to them in the end. Our next speaker is Marta Ray Garcia, and she will take the discussion forward, specifically talking about philanthrocapitalism in relation to policy and governance. Marta is full professor of management at the University of A Coruña, Spain. Her research focuses on civil society organizations, nonprofits, and philanthropy, particularly comparative studies on foundations. Her work on this topic has appeared in journals such as Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, American Behavioral Scientist, Nonprofit Management and Leadership, and books such as Handbook of Corporate Foundations. She has served as founding board member of the European Research Network on Philanthropy, member of the ESSEC Philanthropy Chairs Scientific Committee, member of the Canadian Philanthropy Partnership Research Network, and member of the Advisory Council on the Spanish Association of Foundations. Over to you, Marta. You have around 15 minutes.
Thanks so much, Bioma, for your introduction, and thanks to David McCoy for this wonderful opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper. I'm not going to focus on philanthrocapitalism, which in philanthropy research is a very kind of a specific approach to philanthropy, very much US oriented. My intervention will rather focus on a more long-range growth topic, which is the governance of global foundation philanthropy, using Adam's paper as a stepping stone. So I will try to provide a more general overview of the main topics within the ongoing academic discussion on the involvement of global philanthropic foundations connected to global companies in the policy arena. Just a first clarification, I will use the term philanthropic foundations to talk about any foundation that has philanthropic activity. Okay, so I won't be using the Danish typology, but rather a more global typology. So I coincide with Adam that this paper is on a very special case, but I think the paper is so interesting because it suggests it opens some critical aspects for discussion that may be applicable to any global philanthropic foundation with commercial interests in different regions of the world. So my intervention will be along the four main dimensions that bundle these scholarly critiques on the activity of such foundations, and that is the legal and tax environment, internal governance, resources and goals and programs and societal impact, and of course resources. So if we could please change to the next slide. So as for the first topic, legal and tax environment, this first dimension ties back mainly to tax benefits. It's important to note that in many regions, not all regions of the world, but in many regions of the world, foundation strategies are constrained by public policy and constrained by regulations. And this includes, at the moment of registration, for example, the requirement for a minimum endowment. We call endowment that portion of the capital of a foundation that is attached to philanthropic activities. Also, policies can influence foundations' activity through payout requirements, that is, setting the minimum amount of or portion over assets or income that should be devoted to philanthropic activities. And also mainly policy and legal tax environment shape the activity of foundations because it modulates the extent to which foundations can develop economic activities, directly, indirectly, related to the mission or unrelated to the mission. And of course, legal environment determines the extent and existence of tax benefits that lower the costs of operating such foundations, of their investments, and also of the donations that they receive. So scholarly critique on this dimension is mainly about compliance and how difficult it is to assess in the case of global philanthropic foundations that are active in different regions of the world, whether all these policy and tax and legal requirements are being enforced and complied with. So if we could please go to the next slide. At the same time, any philanthropic foundation in the world, endowed or not, with commercial interests or not, is inherently oriented towards influencing the public arena because they pursue public benefit purposes when they do philanthropy. There's this quote by this Cop call that is really, really clear. I mean, foundations engage in policy when they push their vision, when they participate in public benefit agendas, when they network, when they select beneficiaries, areas of activity, partners, etc., etc. So, given that they are also non-profit institutions from a tax perspective, the main scholarly critique here is why should foundations be provided tax benefits when they are private institutions that are mingling in public policy? And this is, at the end of the day, an indirect public subsidy. So why shouldn't be instead using these resources to be channeled directly to publicly funded programs and being managed and controlled by governments? So this is the main aspect of critique here. If we shift, please, to the next slide, foundation governance. Let me just very briefly step into, in very general terms, the differences between a foundation and other types of nonprofits and commercial companies. So in the case of foundations, different from nonprofit associations, there are no members who have political rights, who have a vote on the endeavors of the foundation, and different from commercial companies, foundations do not have owners with economic rights, shareholders. So we have endowed foundations, because not all foundations are endowed, but in the case of endowed foundations, foundation assets originate from donations by the founder or founders. They may be individuals, organizations, and they fund their philanthropic activity and their general activities with the returns obtained on those capital, on those assets. So the endowment is attached to public benefit purposes over the long term, meaning that foundation governance is all about control and stability into the future. And this ties back to the idea that in foundations, the board is co-opted. So the founder or founders appoint the first board, and those appointed board members appoint future ones. So there's control and there's stability in the case of endowed foundations. So the scholarly critique here is, that depending on board composition and renewal rules, depending on how the governance of the foundation, and if there's a related company, also the corporation is structured, these foundations may be autocratically governed. So that's the main critique here. But if we please shift to the next slide, critiques about foundations governance are really intense when we refer about two foundations connected to commercial activities. And here I want to distinguish three main types. I insist globally, not the Danish case, but globally. So we have company sponsor or corporate foundations that depend on an annual budget that is donated by the related company. This is not the case of NNF. We have foundations that directly manage not only not-for-profit philanthropic activities, but also commercial activities. They can sometimes do it indirectly because they create, for example, a work integration social enterprise. That would be an example. And this second type is very connected to the social economy and to social enterprises model. And then we have the case of NNF, what are called commercial, industrial, controlling foundations. There are different names and they are all over the world. So, in the case of the company sponsor foundation, the foundation fully depends on the company. But in the case of a commercial or industrial foundation, there's like high interdependency between both. This high interdependency may put at risk the future of the foundation if the commercial interests go wrong, but also it can alternatively feel like a self-reinforcing cycle where capital is accumulated on the side of the business, and the foundation endowment grows, and its income grows, and its power grows, which I guess is the case of NNF. So just as a last note on this topic, in some countries, such as in the US, antitrust law prevents the existence of commercial foundations. In other countries, it's a possibility. In the countries where this is possible, this is a typical instrument, for example, for family firms that want to secure their legacy into the future and keep the company together. Or, for example, in very turbulent markets, for example, traditional media, there are well-known newspapers who have created a foundation that is now the main shareholder of the newspaper. But when this model is actively promoted by public authorities at a country level, this is at the end of the day just a protectionist measure. I mean, you are protecting your industry against hostile takeovers, particularly from foreign competitors. And that's why we have lots of controlling or commercial foundations in Sweden, Denmark, Germany, among other countries over the world. So here the critique is always, how do these potentially conflicting logics interplay, and how this interplay affects foundation governance, understood as the distribution rules of power and also resources. The next line of critique is about the financials of philanthropic foundations. So if we go please to the next slide. Here the critique is threefold. First, is the payout sufficient? Because the law normally sets a minimum, but is it sufficient? Is it sufficient vis-a-vis commercial goals? Is it sufficient vis-a-vis tax benefits? The second critique is, when you have a mega size endowed foundation, this may lead to disproportionate influence over a particular field of public benefit activities, or even over a government. And third, these mega foundations mainly operate in fields where power dynamics are acutely changing right now, and this adds another layer of complexity. So because it affects who funds the field. Is the field funded by public administration? Is the field funded by private actors? Who are the private actors? Are they accountable? And this leads to the last dimension. If we can please go to the next slide, which is about goals, programs, and impact of philanthropic foundations. Could we please go to the next slide? Thank you so much. So this last dimension ties back to accountability, basically. Who takes the decisions? Who benefits from the foundation? How are the philanthropic activities undertaken? What's their impact? And lines of scholarly critique along this dimension have to do first with the lack of consistency between the foundation mission and the actual corporate operations. For example, the case of techno and social media billionaires who are involved in philanthropy and maybe are not paying attention to the effects on mental health of social media and AI and the like. Also, critiques, on foundations that are as powerful as to impose a narrative on a certain field. For example, women's health in India, another line of critique is about the opacity of the internal grant-making and decision-making procedures in the foundation. And the last and very populated line of critique from academics has to do with not properly managing the unavoidable conflicts of interests that come up. Not only about the business and civil society logics that coexist in a philanthropic foundation that is connected to commercial interests, and it's a hybrid organization, and these different logics will collide at some point, and there are tensions that need to be managed, but particularly conflicts of interests that arise when philanthropic foundations are active in the same field that the company makes its business operations. And that's the case again of NNF with activity in the health field and connections to pharmaceutical companies. So I've run out of time. I will be glad to discuss any questions at the end, and thanks so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. It seems quite clear from your presentation that one of the things that makes the comparative analysis or in-depth study of foundations or philanthropies in general more difficult is just the diversity of forms and enterprise, and how it's difficult to decide how one might adjudicate on what is taking place under that umbrella. Our final presenter today, Tobias Young, will shed light on some of these points by looking at the evolution of philanthropy. Tobias is the director and founder of Scotland's first research centre dedicated to philanthropy studies, the Centre for the Study of Philanthropy and Public Good at the University of St Andrews. His research explores diverse philanthropy traditions, especially community philanthropy and the role of foundations and trusts. He co-edits major philanthropy publications, leads the the European Research Network on Philanthropy, and serves as a trustee for Foundation Scotland. Tobias has held previous research and leadership roles in London and internationally, including visiting professorships and editorial duties. Tobias, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So very depending where you are joining us from, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Delighted to be able to join the conversation. And I think prior to opening up for our discussion, let us try to contextualize the debate and the stories we've heard so far, both historically and conceptually. Next slide, please. Now, a decade ago, in a piece for the online journal The Conversation, I equated foundations to an octopus, arguing the two have much in common. Their non-rigid form means they're both flexible and able to squeeze into areas that are inaccessible to others. Both the octopus and the foundation are seen as great problem solvers, and they have far-reaching tentacles, but understanding their movements is difficult. Both can hide in plain sight. Both have a spectrum of defense mechanism against potential enemies. And so with that imagery in mind, I want to spend the next 15 minutes to do three things. First of all, I want to offer some critical reflections on the nature and idea of the foundation. My central point is that many of the tension and questions we are engaging with today are not new. They have been present for centuries, if not millennia. Secondly, I want to address the unresolved question of what actually counts as philanthropy. We all use it, but the definitions we currently work with are by and large unsatisfactory. And then finally, I propose a set of tensions and underpinning questions as a framework, and will argue that we should actively and critically reflect on what we mean by philanthropy, because it's only then and on that basis that we can begin to answer the bigger question: which forms of philanthropy are legitimate and worthy of societal support, and at the same time, which practices only masquerade as philanthropy. Next slide, please. So let us first of all look at the origins and tensions inherent in the foundation form. When we talk about foundations, we tend to start with early 20th century America, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, but this framing is utterly misleading, because the idea of endowed institutions for charitable purposes is far older, far more widespread. And here's the key insight: they were almost never purely altruistic. In the Greek and Roman worlds, elite benefaction was never a one-way gift. Wealthy citizens built theatres, baths, distributed grains, but in return they gained titles, status, political capital, so the public good was real, but the private rewards were too. In the Islamic tradition, the Waqf, an inalienable endowment, funded mosques, schools, fountains, hospitals, yet many Waqfs were established not only for public benefit, but also as family Waqfs, designed to shelter states from rulers and creditors and to keep wealth within chosen lines of descent. So two patrimonial and philanthropic motives coexist. In England, from the late Middle Ages onwards, legal devices like trusts were often deployed for dual purposes. Landowners used them to avoid feudal dues and retain post-mortem control over property, but they also enabled gifts to charitable causes. The Tudor statutes were as much about fiscal stability and social order as about promoting benevolence. So charity was encouraged, yes, but also disciplined and regulated in the service of the state. So whether we look at Roman civic benefaction, Islamic Waqfs, or English trusts, or any other ones, the pattern is always the same. The entities sit at the intersection of altruism, self-interest, and state interest. Thus, when we criticize foundations today for mixing motives, we are actually criticizing their defining characteristic, the very thing that makes them durable. And they do not because they're purely altruistic, but precisely because they reconcile private motives with public functions. Next slide, please. So let us then jump to the 20th century, when foundations became explicit shapers of societies. First of all, Rockefeller Foundation, big name, founded in 1913, became a global force in public health. It spearheaded campaigns against hookworm in the American South and laid the groundwork for the field of international health as we know today, and helped also rehabilitate the public image of a family long vilified as ruthless monopolists. Similarly, the Carnegie Corporation invested heavily in libraries, education, peace initiatives, reshaping American civic life. But Andrew Carnegie's gospel of wealth philosophy, that the rich have a moral duty to distribute their fortunes, was also a way of defending vast private accumulations of wealth in an age of growing inequality. The Ford Foundation pushed even further. By mid-century, it had become one of the most influential actors in global development, arts, and higher education. In many countries, it operated almost like a quasi-state, with programs and staff that rivaled official government agencies. And this influence was not without controversy. In the Cold War context, Ford's activities often dovetailed with US foreign policy interests, blurring the line between philanthropy and geopolitics. And all of these examples highlight two aspects to consider. First, foundations are agenda-setting institutions. They define and frame the problems we see as urgent, often for generations. Second, they do so with very limited democratic accountability. No one elected Rockefeller, Carnegie, or Ford, yet their visions became baked into educational systems, health infrastructures, and international institutions that still shape our lives. And that is why contemporary debates about organizations such as the Novo Nordisk Foundations are nothing new. Seen in this longer historic arc, today's controversies are not anomalies. They're the latest chapter in a centuries-long story of how endowed institutions blur the line between private wealth and public good. But here it is where it really gets interesting, because the undemocratic nature of foundation is not only problematic, there's another side to the story. Precisely because they are insulated from short-term electoral pressures and political risk, foundation can sometimes act as risk capital for social change, because it allows foundations to back causes too controversial, too stigmatized, or too politically costly for elected governments. And there are plenty of examples illustrating this. HIV/AIDS in the 80s and 90s, when governments were silent, hesitant, or openly hostile due to stigma, philanthropy actors like the Ford Foundation stepped in. They funded prevention, community care, and advocacy at a time when public authorities refused. Civil rights in the United States. Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie funded litigation, organizing, and leadership long before state governments recognized equal rights. Global health and neglected diseases. Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, others invested in vaccines and drugs for malaria, TB, and neglected tropical diseases, areas neglected by both governments and the markets. And the list goes on: tobacco control, climate change, independent journalism, prison reform, even avant-garde art. Again and again, foundations have stepped in where governments hesitated. The lesson here then is that being outside democratic structures cuts both ways. On the one hand, yes, it raises real concerns about legitimacy and accountability. On the other hand, it allows foundations to take risks, to champion unpopular causes, and to persist where governments are constrained by votes, vested interests, or lobby power. And that hybridity, that blend of private and public motives, is not an accident. It is the very nature of foundation. And perhaps we simply need to accept that foundations will always serve both self-interest and public interest to different degrees, in different times, in different places. However, I think the mistake we're making in debates about foundations is that we routinely conflate the foundation as a legal institutional vehicle with philanthropy as a moral ideal. And that is a category error. Foundations are not philanthropic by nature. There are mechanisms through which philanthropy may be practiced, and equally through which less altruistic agendas can be pursued. So the difficulty is compounded because most of us hold strong intuitions about philanthropy, while at the same time there is no shared operational definition. Next slide, please. So philanthropy's definitional challenges go back to its origins in 460 BCE, and from the very outside, the idea of philanthropy invited varied interpretation, and this semantic elasticity continues. The result is definitional disarray. Some cast philanthropy as a feeling, generosity, benevolence, others as action, giving, volunteering, serving, still others as resource, money, time, talent, networks. At times, philanthropy is framed as an aspiration, making the world a better place, or as an institution, foundations, endowed charity, membership organizations. These definitions overlap, they contradict, they blur into neighboring concepts such as charity, arms, and benevolence. And to address the conceptual disarray, some authors have sought to consolidate philanthropy's defining characteristics into a singular, overarching definition. The problem is that the definitional benefits of these attempts are not always clear. Others have argued against such a move, questioning both the feasibility and desirability of a unified definition of philanthropy. However, leaving definitional ambiguity unchecked carries risk as well, because we are left with a term that does enormous political work without stable conceptual underpinning. Such weak, fuzzy definitions allow philanthropy to act as a conceptual cloak, a way of wrapping self-interest, corporate branding, or even predatory practices in the benign language of generosity. And this is why I think that we should treat philanthropy as a discursive field that is organized by tensions, and we need to interrogate those tensions. Next slide, please. Because if you look across the literature on philanthropy, there appear to be 7 conflicting ideas or attention points about philanthropy. The first, politics and power, highlights philanthropy's entanglement with political economies, legal regimes, and knowledge production, including who gets to define philanthropy, on what terms, and with which agenda-setting capacity, tax privileges, governance roles, etc. The second, structure and settings, examines the organizational and contextual forms through which philanthropy is actually recognized. The third, act as an agency, asks who counts as a philanthropist and on what terms. Directionality notes that definitions often assume a unilateral resource flow from the rich to the poor. That's not the case if you look at philanthropy globally, because this point probes whether philanthropy is done to others or with them and foregrounds the relational ethics of the gift. Resource and capital questions whether philanthropy is primarily financial or encompass multiple capitals, points already pointed to beforehand. And motivations and intents acknowledge a spectrum of mixed and shifting motives. It separates why actors give from what they do and what results are achieved. And then finally, impact and benefit challenges the assumption of philanthropy as being inherently good. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And all of these tensions point out that what we sometimes highlight remains really underexplored in debates on philanthropy. So these are recognized, but we don't really discuss them publicly. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at these tensions and reframe this as questions for exploration to get a better understanding, who, what, why, how, for whom, where, and when, these tensions we just highlight become prompts for communal reflection. They give us tools to interrogate the assumptions, the boundary work, and power effects embedded in every invocation of philanthropy. Who can do philanthropy? Because philanthropy is often associated with the rich, the wealthy, and large corporations. And this is a popular misconception. The philanthropic ecosystem is far more encompassing. It is not limited to any special class, community, cohort, or category. What resources can be used for philanthropy? Philanthropy is often considered as the giving of money. This view is too narrow, because in the philanthropy field it is recognized that any form of resource can be useful. Time, volunteering, dedicating time, treasure, providing financial or material assets, talent, sharing skills or expertise, and ties the social networks and connections. Why is philanthropy being done? Because unlike charitable giving, which is focused on alleviating immediate need, philanthropy is geared towards addressing the root causes of underlying problems. It is always political, and as such, it needs to be strategic and intentional. How should it be done? Core characteristic of philanthropy is that it is voluntary in nature. It is driven by choice rather than compulsion, and this distinguishes from taxation and other forms of mandatory giving. Who benefits? Philanthropy should not come with an explicit expectation of a material return to the giver. It should be done without seeking financial gain or material benefits. And this differentiates philanthropy from areas such as corporate social responsibility, cause-related marketing, where there may be clear expectations of financial returns. Where does it take place? Philanthropy is context-dependent, yes, but it must not be limited by specific settings. So while philanthropy occurs within different geographical, cultural, and political contexts, philanthropy in Japan might look different from philanthropy in Germany or in Scotland, they're all valid forms and expressions of similar core practices as per the preceding criteria. Finally, when does philanthropy take place? Philanthropy is neither confined to a particular era nor period, nor is it bound by time. And this criterion is essential for understanding philanthropy as an ongoing effort that adapts to contemporary contexts and challenges. And reflected on in this slide, the prominent portrayal and sanctioning of many individual or institutional acts as philanthropy can and needs to be questioned. It provides us with a reference point for those acts that legitimately can claim to be philanthropic and those that might provide public benefit but are not philanthropy. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, let me return to the octopus. Because at the beginning, I suggested that foundations share much in common with these elusive creatures, flexible, far-reaching, hard to grasp, sometimes hiding in plain sight. And what we have seen is that this is not accidental. Foundations are, by their very nature, instruments of control. Personal, familial, corporate, societal. And the difficulty begins when we attach to them the moral halo of philanthropy without reflecting on what philanthropy actually means. And if we use those tensions as prompts for conversation, we can begin to arrive at shared meanings that are explicit, contextual, and accountable. And that in turn gives us the basis for something vital, legitimacy, and trust. Because if we can be clear about what truly counts as philanthropy, we can separate genuine acts of public good from conceptual cloaking. We can celebrate philanthropy's contributions while also holding it to account. So finally, I would like to suggest a kind of conversation triage for philanthropy and foundation. Sometimes the problem is simply not knowing, a lack of clarity or understanding about what foundations are, about what philanthropy is or does. Sometimes it's not working. Philanthropy practices that fail to deliver on their promises or even create unintended harms, and sometimes it is simply not right. Philanthropy that cloaks self-interest, consolidates power, or undermines legitimacy. And these three diagnostic, not knowing, not working, not right, applied through our 7 questions, give us a framework for critical engagement. They give us a way to interrogate philanthropy and foundations critically without losing sight of its possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that final intervention. And, many of us would agree is that maybe the global health priorities and pathways should be shaped by the needs of people rather than the successes and failures of the market. But it remains to be seen the kind of actor that Novo Nordisk Foundation will be in global health. But thank you so much for giving us some necessary and important arguments and some pathways to research and think about these actors. As we come to a close, I thank our panelists, Adam, Marta, and Tobias, for sharing your work. And I also thank all of you, our participants. Please stay connected with ongoing work of UNU IIGH and the Collective for the Political Determinants of Health. We thank you again, and we look forward to your participation in future sessions.